All right, morning everyone, and hello to my fellow panelists and to everyone on the call. And Camilla and Florian and team, thank you for this invitation and for convening this discussion. It's an opportunity to reflect on our work even while we're still in the midst of a crisis, which I guess is part of adaptive practice, which I'll talk a little bit about just now. Let me just make sure I'm sharing this. There we go. So I'm going to cover just two things in my presentation, experiences and lessons of the food coordinating role, and I've got just 5 slides on that. And then harnessing the relationships beyond the crisis, I've just got 2 slides on that. And I also have one data slide to show the sheer magnitude of the CSO, civil society organization contribution. Let's just obviously note, colleagues, that food poverty in South Africa existed before COVID-19, but clearly has been hugely exacerbated by the hard lockdown, by the partial economic collapse. I think that the revised job figures or unemployment figures are coming out later today. And obviously it's been hugely exacerbated by rising infection and fatalities in the hotspots, the COVID hotspots. And we note, of course, that the food crisis is still with us. It's not something that we're talking about in the past. Can I just say that the role of the EDP is to help partners work together to solve difficult or complex problems. So in that sense, I have a disclaimer. We don't have a food relief or a food policy background. Maybe that has been a good thing to help us convene people in the sector. I don't know, I'll respect your feedback on that one. So here's the data slide, and it really just shows the massive contribution from civil society organizations, as well as their citizen and private sector and philanthropy donors since the start of lockdown. I would estimate that it shows at least 50% or indicates at least 50% of the total food relief effort. These figures that you see before you are just from showing the civil society effort. Effectively, we've calculated, let me tell you, I think it's probably still an undercount because we haven't possibly been able to get all the data in from all the grassroots efforts in the Western Cape. So I do want to make that disclaimer. There may also be some overcounting or some duplication. There's a whole discussion that we could have just on the data side, which is perhaps for another day. But we've calculated that at least 3 million people days or people fed for one day, which translates to an average of 42,000 people being fed every day for the 74 days through a combination of parcels, hampers, hot meals, and digital vouchers. So to get the full range of the food relief effort, including from national, provincial, and local government, one would have to add in the 31,000 food parcels that were distributed in the hard lockdown on behalf of the Solidarity Fund, the 45 to 50,000 food parcels distributed on behalf of Western Cape Provincial Government, Department of Social Development, the Western Cape Education Department school feeding scheme, which unlike most parts of the country continued during a hard lockdown. The non-metro municipalities, which were subsidized by about 16 million of the 84 million from Western Cape government for food. The Cape Town Mayor's Relief Fund, which is only really getting going now, which is spending about 12 million rand. And then obviously more recently, the SASSA Social Distress Relief Fund, which has taken a huge amount of time to get going and is very slow in the Western Cape, only 118,500 recipients to date. So maybe just to summarize the approach of the Western Cape, or how we try to put this thing together. We said it had to be a whole of society approach, or was an approach. And this is based on a recognition that government on its own cannot deal with the food crisis or any other major crisis and needs partners. So the question is, how does government, public sector, which doesn't always work well with business or civil society or academics and researchers, how can we put a sort of two-way relationship together between government and its partners? And one of the aims of the forum has been to strengthen the relationships and build trust between all the role players. It's part of the role has been to try and collect the civil society data that I showed you in the previous slide, address some of the challenges or issues affecting the delivery of food relief on a day-to-day basis, encourage greater connection, communication, and collaboration between all the stakeholders, to join the dots and share information and knowledge, and then perhaps also to try and link the short-term, immediate humanitarian food aid relief efforts to some of the longer-term campaigns, policy processes, alternative ideas about decentralized food systems, and things like that. Just a little bit about the participants. We have about 50 to 60 organizations participating. So it's by no means in a sense, what I'd call a representative forum. I mean, there are 6,000 NGOs just in the Western Cape alone. We can't possibly have all of them participating on one forum by Zoom in the midst of a crisis. So we started off with the larger food NGOs involved in the phase 1 of the lockdown, the national and regional distribution of the food parcels, Africa Tikkun, Food Forward SA, Andy's on our panel, Red Cross, Community Chest, Islamic Relief, Gift of the Givers, Ikamva Labantu, the Warehouse, Lunchbox Fund, etc., etc., etc. We then brought in what we'd call the intermediary food supply networks. So, for example, Ladles of Love, which started off as relatively small, has grown into quite a big effort, supplying 350 to 360 sites and NGOs and CBOs in those sites. Also U-Turn Homeless Ministries, Service Dining Rooms, Pick and Pay, Feed the Nation Foundation, You Cook, etc., etc. And then we've drawn in a selection of community-based organizations, some of the CANs in the most vulnerable and poor areas, NGOs, NPOs, faith-based organization, ecumenical movement, and things like that, Development Action Group, Cork, VPUU, the Philippine Economic Development Initiative, and Egbert's on this call as well. And then we brought in the Western Cape Government Humanitarian Response Team, which is multi-sectoral, as well as officials from the City of Cape Town. So just some of the issues and challenges, and Florian, obviously we don't have a lot of time now to go through everything in detail, but some of the issues that we've had to deal with through this forum over the last 8 to 9 weeks of the crisis, the permits for volunteers during the hard lockdown so that they could move around and do their job, observing social distancing and hygiene during food distribution, dealing with distribution of food affected by levels of violence, which have disrupted food kitchens, as well as gangsterism in communities, the threatened, at the time, draft national government regulations from the Minister of Social Development, which fortunately have been shelved, and the emergence of COVID hotspots. There's been a lot of discussion in the forum around NGO food data mapping. This is a whole discussion in and of itself. Data governance is very important, but it can sidetrack, in my opinion, when it becomes data for the sake of data. And Florian and Camilla, I think it would be useful to continue a more specialized discussion, convene meeting around some of the difficulties we found in collecting this data, the limitations of asking NGOs to self-register and self-report, which is an important issue relating to issues of accountability and transparency during processes like this. Everyone uses divergent measurement systems and standards, and it's been quite hard to pull together so that apples can be compared with apples. There've been a number of parallel food data capturing processes and technologies. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can cause confusion amongst communities and NGOs when they're asked repeatedly by different organizations to fill in forms and register their data. ultimately, ideally, one would want one system. And that obviously there's limitations to this sort of meeting because of lack of access to data and technology for organizations in poor and vulnerable areas. So Zoom and MS Teams and those sorts of meetings that we're having now obviously can exclude many people. There have also been many innovations that we have picked up and we've tried to record. And again, we don't have time to go through all of them. We've tried to start looking at the pros and cons of different types of emergency food aid during a pandemic. What systems empower households and communities and promote local choice, as opposed to which tend to be more top-down delivery systems. What empowers traders and spouses and local dealers, as opposed to disempowering them during this process. There's been a lot of issues around transportation and logistics and safety, the costs and value for money, the different approaches to nutrition and what is good and what is bad, as well as health and safety. And there's been a big learning on types of platforms to support digital vouchers, which is perhaps one of the growth areas of the future. And maybe just to focus on 7 lessons that we've picked up just in the short time that this forum has been going. And perhaps, and again, I mean, a lot of members of the forum are on this call, so welcome feedback that differs with me in any way. But I think what has helped us is focus on doing rather than debating. So we've tried to focus conversations, particularly because we're in a crisis situation, on specific actionable issues rather than interminable shopping lists of issues that everyone could have raised from government side, from civil society side. Secondly, we've tried to make the forum, or partnership as I'd like to call it, to become a source of accurate and reliable information and feedback. Obviously, there's a lot of disinformation and fake news particularly during the crisis. So where can we turn to get accurate and reliable information? Thirdly, stressing the importance of relationship work and creating a safe space to build trust through non-judgmental listening and responsiveness, something that you are encouraging on this call as well. And I think 2 things have emerged. I've certainly witnessed a great deal of NGO to NGO collaboration. So within civil society and then between civil society and public sector relationships, a growing amount of trust. Fourthly, we've tried to take on an adaptive approach. Things change very quickly during a crisis, and it's not helpful to wait for the perfect plan or the perfect set of data. You need a good enough plan and good enough data to step into action. And then while you're taking action in the weekly meetings, to reflect, evaluating, learn while doing, adapt, adjust, pivot, and then repeat. That's the approach that we've taken. We've also tried to encourage work across institutional boundaries, particularly in the public sector. And here 2 things have become quite important. The role of setting up an internal partnership within big public sector institutions. So, for example, the humanitarian coordination response within the Western Cape government hasn't just been the Department of Social Development or the Western Cape Education Department feeding scheme. It has been drawn from a range of different departments, and that has been hugely helpful. And then to do that, we try and help public sector representatives to see the overall food system and food relief system, not just the departmental mandates, because many public sector institutions struggle with that. They start rigidly with their mandates and they say, well, that's outside of my mandate, so I can't participate, I can't fund it. And that's not very helpful in responding to a crisis. Sixthly, we've encouraged collaborative leadership skill sets to value relationships, to listen in a defensive, non-judgmental way. As Cape Town Together has said, to move at the speed of trust and not just at the speed of action. And then the final point, just to raise, I think it is helpful in contested terrain, and let's face it, food policy, food systems, food delivery, food relief, humanitarian aid can be quite a contested terrain. that to have a neutral intermediary that perhaps doesn't know much about food, as a convener of the forum, may have helped. I'm happy to get feedback on that one. So final two slides, Florian, harnessing the relationship beyond the crisis. I've just got 5 suggestions on this one. With the rise of the role of civil society organizations in driving food relief, probably more so than the public sector, there's no reason why they cannot continue to drive food policy and food campaigns, food security campaigns. I think we have to build on the emergent partnerships and networks that have developed within communities at the hyperlocal level. The emerging social solidarity across race and class that we've seen in our city and our region, and partnerships that have emerged between farmers, food producers, formal and informal retailers, and NGOs and communities. So the relationships that have been built in the crisis stand us in good stead for the recovery period. Secondly, I think there's an opportunity to advocate very strongly for food security and diverse food systems to become central to the Western Cape government's recovery plan that they're working on right now. We need to build on a newfound public sector appreciation for the role of civil society. That's why the data looking backwards is very important. And how do we help government shift from a kind of participation approach, which is government draws up a plan, consults people on it, and then gets some feedback and goes and implements its plan, to a more partnering approach. Thirdly, how do we harness the energy of new networks? So for example, like the Cape Town Together Food Grows initiative. And here I think we need to look carefully at how we connect the rather fragmented top-down authorizing environment and the bottom-up mobilizing environment together. Fourthly, and this is an area that I certainly don't know enough about, but Florian and Camilla, this is where I think your research groups can help. How do we connect the process of digitalization of social grants and the circulation of mobile money to community economic recovery plans? There's traditional divides between social and economic and spatial development approaches to local economic development, and these need to be overcome. And I think we need to think out of the box for what we understand as community economic recovery. And then finally, I think that there's more scope for transdisciplinary research, closer collaboration between science and society, bringing the practitioners, the policymakers, and the researchers more closely together. Let me just conclude then with a question. I mean, there's no doubt about it that a crisis is an opportunity to do things differently, to challenge and overturn existing mindsets, the conventional wisdoms, frameworks, and approaches. As we've seen in the Cape Town drought crisis, where emergent, decentralized, and hybrid community water systems were rapidly re-centralized because of pressure from water utilities and municipal revenue departments, the window of opportunities closes very quickly as soon as a crisis comes to an end. Systems have a tendency to reset themselves back to the status quo very quickly. We cannot assume that any gains and any new innovations and any spaces that have opened up during this crisis will remain in 3 and 4 and 5 months' time. And then just to remind ourselves that the crisis, the food and hunger and poverty crisis continues. Infections and fatalities are still rising in poor and vulnerable communities as we sit here. Food relief efforts themselves are being threatened by infections. We have donor and volunteer fatigue setting in, and government has effectively run out of money for food. Thanks.